Hi, I'm Dolly Vasta, and welcome back once again to For Art's Sake. New Jersey is very rich in heritage, and today we're taping at the State Museum in Trenton, New Jersey, and we'll be bringing you a retrospective of the exhibition of the New Jersey Pinelands, their people, tradition, and environment. You'll also be meeting two very knowledgeable and charming people, Rita Moonsamy and David Cohen. Rita, why is the Pinelands so rich in folk life?
Well, a major part of the reason that it's so rich in folk life is that it's such a rich natural environment. The Pinelands National Reserve, which is the title that's given to that large area that the Pinelands Commission and the federal and state government designated in South Jersey, actually, instead of just being only pine trees and pine forests, actually encompasses swamps, meadows, rivers and bays, and agricultural areas. And so in all of those areas, there are many different resources for people over time to have drawn on to create traditional activities, lifestyles, and artifacts, and some of which are depicted by the activities going on here.
Well, there's so much of our state, as we said before, that so many of us who are native Jerseyans have never really been to, in the sense of seeing what went on. We've been through it.
That's exactly the case, and depending on the route they take to go through it, they may have the notion, as I said, that either it's one type of environment, just sand and pine trees, or that there are no towns, or that everyone that lives there is living as a hermit in the woods. Of course, none of which is the fact. I think that you could say that's true of the north and the south of the state. In the north, we often have this image of people rushing through on the turnpike and thinking that there's nothing in northern New Jersey other than industry, whereas we know, in fact, that particularly from a folk life standpoint, New Jersey and the cities are rich in ethnic diversity and ethnic culture and wonderful ethnic neighborhoods. And so it isn't just the view from the turnpike. Neither are the Pinelands just the view that you get from Route 70 going to the shore.
Are the Pinelands folk receptive to tourists just stopping in?
The people there in the Pinelands are like people everywhere else. This is one of the things that's important for us to know. And they are friendly. You know, as individuals, some are more friendly than others. There certainly are many commercial establishments, and there are certainly many established ways for tourists to come into the area and talk to people. And I would say that your chance of getting to chat amiably with people in the Pinelands is as good as it is anywhere else in the state.
I want to take you with me now to some of these other exhibits so we can talk about them. We are standing in front of two, I'm going to call them complexes. Looks like a bird condominium, and you are standing directly in front of, looks like a bird co-op. Can you tell us a little bit about them? Who they were done by and so on?
This birdhouse was built by Clifford Frazee, who is a cedar farmer and tree farmer in Forked River. This is a representative of the type you'd more normally see. Now this, what its maker calls the Purple Martin Palace, was built by a man who was a blueberry farmer in addition to being a carpenter. And he had spent so much of his time watching and enjoying those birds and knew well what kinds of accommodations they needed, that he invested all of that attention and affection for the birds into this grand project. Mr. Christopherson talks about the very social nature of these birds. And in Pinelands Folklife, we have quoted him as talking about how the males like to sit out on the porches on hot summer nights.
Oh, that's wonderful.
And the females always stay in the compartment. And so he made certain that his condominium or palace, as we can variously call it, had all of the features that were necessary for it. And he actually had this up in his yard for many years, and he said could see the same families of birds coming every year in around April. So these are really wonderful, whimsical examples of how people know their environment, know their cohabitants in the environment. You know, when they live in a rural area, know the animals and the birds as well as the plants. and how that becomes a really important intrinsic part of their lives. And they actually make things, stories, birdhouses, paintings, that show that knowledge and that affection for their environment. I think it provides us good insight into the fact that people create art in places where we don't think about art being created. But in fact, those are some of the most important places. They're in our everyday lives, in our personal lives, that we draw on the resources around us to make something which gives us satisfaction. Les has great pride in the workmanship of this. He explains that you couldn't get a razor blade into any crevice in this birdhouse. He invested his pride of workmanship in it, as well as his knowledge of and his affection for the environment and the purple martins in it. And that is an important thing to know about contexts for art.
Why don't we continue along? It looks like we could just step right up and walk right on through there. Would you care to introduce us to your friend here?
This is Cliff Frazee. He's a cedar farmer who lives in Forked River near the Barnegat Bay area. And his family has been doing cedar farming and oystering and many of the other traditional occupations in that area for many generations. The number of cedar swamps, which is where this tree grows and where farmers like Cliff Frazee build this kind of road to do their work in the swamp, the number of those swamps has diminished considerably since the 1700s, say. It is still an important wood to New Jersey artifacts, but there are not nearly so many people involved in the harvest of it now as there were at one time. Shingle mining was done in the swamps, particularly in the area around Dennisville, and one of the illustrations here explains how large cedar trees were buried in the muck in some of the swamps in that area, and people devised ways of digging out those large logs and used them because of the preservative-like qualities that being buried in the muck gave it, the cedar, used it to make shingles. That continued until around the first quarter of this century, but is no longer done. The cedar has been used for many, many important things in the Pinelands, whole Pinelands area, in particular to build boats. Builders like Joe Reed, boat builders like Joe Reed, whose work is exhibited here as well, talk about the excellent qualities of Jersey cedar for Jersey boats, its lightness, its pliability, its resistance to moisture, so that when you build a boat from it, you can curve it the way it needs to be curved for the Jersey waters and for the uses that they make of it here. And you can count on it lasting for a long, long time.
Now let's meet historical researcher David Cohen and learn about an unusual boat called a sneak box.
This is a genuine Barnegat Bay sneak box, and according to the legend about its name, it is used for sneaking up on ducks in order to duck hunt. But actually, that's not the way it's used at all. The sneak box is used to set out the decoys that are used as lures to lure the ducks to land in the bays and in the marshes alongside the bays. And then the duck hunter takes the sneak box and beaches it in the meadows alongside the bays and covers the sneak box with the marsh grass and waits there for the ducks to be lured down to feed among the decoys. And of course, then he can get a clear shot in order to hunt them. And the sneak box actually has a rack on the back of it, which is for the placing of the decoys. These boats were originally used under sail. They would be sailed out to the gunning grounds. Then in more modern days, they were towed out in motorboats to the location and then rowed by the duck hunter in order to gun, as they say, for wildfowl. And this is an activity that still goes on. It's a very active tradition, and in fact, the New Jersey decoys that are associated with this artifact are probably New Jersey's most famous folk art. One of the exhibits here shows 3 generations of decoy carving in the Shords family tradition, going back to Harry V. Shords I, who is probably New Jersey's most famous decoy carver, and then his son Harry Mitchell Shords, and then the current Harry V. Shords, who is still carving in northern Cape May County. There was also differences in decoy styles in different sections of Barnegat Bay. There are even 4 different schools of decoy carving. The decoys that are made at the head of the bay are different from the decoys that are made at Parkertown, which in turn are different from the decoys at Barnegat, the town of Barnegat, and they are different from the decoys at Tuckerton. So that there are these 4 different schools of carving, and the real collectors of decoys can tell which town the decoy came from, and in fact even which carver it was made by just looking at the decoy.
Was there a reason behind these differences, or did that just depend on the carver himself and how he felt about it?
Well, there are certain characteristics that they all have in common, and those can be grounded very much in the environment.
They look like ducks.
In other words, well, actually, they don't look that much like ducks. They're really abstractions of ducks. According to the duck hunters, ducks can't see that well, and as long as what the ducks are attracted to is the movement of the decoy in the water. And so that's the main thing, is the way that the decoys behave in the water. But what they all have in common is that they're all made from New Jersey cedar, just as the sneak box is made from cedar, which comes from the cedar swamp, which is another environment in the exhibition. And they're all hollow and light, because Barnegat Bay is a very shallow bay, and consequently the decoys have to be light and very buoyant. In terms of the different schools of carving, this is more a reflection of the influence of individual carvers, because they were highly respected members of their communities, and other people would imitate, say for instance, the Parker family style of decoy carving, which set the style of the Parkertown decoy, just as people would imitate the Harry Shords decoy from Tuckerton, and therefore you got the Tuckerton school of decoy carving. So what you have here is the interplay between the environment and the people, which is really the whole theme of this exhibition. The interesting thing about decoys as collectibles is that the old decoys are the most valuable ones.
That's right.
And in the Shords family, the Harry V. Shords the first, his decoys can be sold for thousands of dollars, whereas Harry V., the current Harry V. Shords, whose decoys to the average person would look almost identical to his grandfather's, but they're new, and Harry Shords the third does say that there are certain differences, but his decoys sell for about $100. And that is purely a matter of the collecting market, because the new doesn't sell as much it isn't as pricey as the old. Yet the Harry V. Shords decoys as folk art are every much as fine and beautiful objects as the decoys made by his grandfather. So you do have the ups and downs of the market that's involved with decoys.
David, is there a difference between the Pine Barrens and the Pinelands?
Yes, actually there is. The Pine Barrens is a term that refers to the early perception of the region as an area unsuited for agriculture. And in fact, in terms of this exhibit, coincides with only one of the environments, which is primarily the upland woodlands of the region, and possibly also the cedar swamps as well. But the federal government, when they established the Pinelands National Reserve in 1978, mapped a region that in some ways included areas that were not part of the original Pine Barrens. And that includes, among other things, the environment that we're sitting in right now, which is the rivers and bays, especially the bay section. There are sections of Barnegat Bay that were really not originally part of the Pine Barrens, but are included in the legislation that sets up the Pinelands National Reserve to enable them to be protected as well.
The word piney, where did that come from?
Actually, the name piney goes all the way back to the mid-19th century at least, and it was very much associated with a negative stereotype of the people of the pines. It was a stereotype that was very much associated with the kind of activities that you see pictured behind me, which was the charcoal burning that was associated with some of the industries of the Pine Barrens. This is where pine trees were partially burned under a controlled burn in order to create charcoal, and it was used as the fuel, for instance, in the iron industry. And it's an activity that continued up to the 1950s and early 1960s. But the piney stereotype was of a group of people living isolated in the woods, the way these charcoal burners lived back in the woods, that had little contact with the outside world and tended to marry among themselves. Actually, one of the things we're trying to do in this exhibition is to show how limited that stereotype is of the Pinelands, because this is only one activity in one environment of the Pinelands. And one of the things we're trying to show in this exhibition is that there is a tremendous variety of activities and types of people that live and have lived in the Pinelands. I should also mention that the term piney was originally a very negative term. It was something that nobody would admit to being. Nobody wanted to be a piney, up until recently. And now the term has become one of regional pride, so that you'll see some people that wear Piney Power hats or their Piney Power bumper stickers. It's become a point of regional pride throughout southern New Jersey. And there are even some people who you wouldn't normally think of as having a Piney identity, such as the Puerto Rican agricultural workers who have moved into the Pine Barrens originally as seasonal workers, but now many of them live year-round in the Pine Barrens. And there's one photograph in the exhibition of a Puerto Rican agricultural worker wearing a Piney Power hat. And it shows that now people who normally would not have been considered Pineys in the past are considering themselves Piney in the present, such as this Puerto Rican farm worker. And there's an element of pride behind the word.
Now, I hear that you are a master at some of these old myths and legends. Could you just kind of tell me a couple of them?
Well, I'm not a master of them, I'm not a storyteller, but related to the term piney is perhaps, I think, the most famous legend of the Pine Barrens, which is the legend about the origin of the pineys, which many people confused with the history of the Pine Barrens, and it was very much tied into the stereotype of the Pinelands and the Pine Barrens. And this basically saw the pineys as being descendants from Hessian soldiers who fought in the Revolutionary War, of Quakers that couldn't fit in with the Quaker tenants and consequently went off into the interior reaches of New Jersey to live, of the so-called pine robbers who were basically individuals like Jerry Mulliner, Joseph Mulliner, who during the Revolutionary War was sort of New Jersey's Robin Hood, who would rob from the rich and give to the poor, at least according to the recent versions of the legend. He was a Robin Hood type character. And also other groups of people like the Indians that I mentioned previously who remained and went off into the interior. Now actually this legend is an oversimplification and to some degrees a romanticization of where the Pineys came from. Basically, they are descended from many of the same families that settled throughout the rest of New Jersey. It included some families that were Quakers, but it's not that they couldn't fit in with the Quaker faith, it's just that when they moved into the interior, they were more suited to the activities of the Methodist circuit riders who would go into the interiors rather than continuing affiliation with the Quaker meetings. It's true that Joseph Mulliner lived in the Pine Barrens, but he left no descendants. Basically, there were people like this all over New Jersey and all over the American colonies, so they weren't really the prototype ancestor of the Piney. Even the Hessian soldier thing is not true in the sense that there are German families in the Pine Barrens, but they go back well before the Revolutionary War, many of them from the same ancestors as the Pennsylvania Germans. At one time, the woodland section, as you have here, was the site of a number of industries. You had towns that were established there, glass-making towns and iron-making towns, and these towns had products that had to be shipped out of the Pinelands. I mean, this was an economic activity.
What type of products, not to?
The product from the iron industry was it was a variety of things, kettles and pots, and including very large kettles that were used sometimes to boil down whale oil, but also smaller kinds of kettles that were used. And then as the industry matured, they made iron pipe, especially for Philadelphia. When Philadelphia Waterworks were established, they used iron pipe that came from the New Jersey Pinelands. By the same token, the products from the glass industry were primarily what was called hollowware, which was bottles, or window light, which was window panes. And then in addition to that, the workers after hours would make small little, what were called whimsies, various kinds of vases and doorstops and paperweights that were also sold and sometimes exchanged within their own communities.
The Pine Barrens has never been equated with farming, but that's not really true.
That's right. In other words, the name Pine Barren indicates that it's an area that's barren, that's not suited for agriculture. And the early maps of New Jersey showed the area as a sandy, barren desert. But the Pinelands National Reserve includes a very large farmland section. Some of the very areas that were thought unsuited for agriculture turned out to be very suited for special sandy soil crops, especially cranberries and blueberries. And then later on, those were the early crops, but later on, sweet potatoes and peaches and melons all have been grown in this in the farmland sections of the Pinelands National Reserve.
Now, this is a very early, what would you call it?
Well, this is a farm market wagon, or a South Jersey wagon. And these are the kinds of wagons, actually, that were used in not only the farmlands, but also in the meadows, because one of the farming activities associated with agriculture, going all the way back to the colonial days, was the cultivating of salt hay, which was used originally to feed livestock and then later on as mulch for florists. This kind of wagon could be outfitted as a hay wagon, or it could be used, such as this one is fitted out as a wagon, a market wagon, to take crops to market. There's an interesting story about this particular wagon. I hunted all over South Jersey to find a good example of one of these farm market wagons, and couldn't find one that I could get very good documentation on. And finally, of all places, I found this particular wagon in Piscataway. And it originally came from Moorestown, in an area adjacent to the Pinelands, but it's identical to the wagons used in the Pinelands. And the reason it was in Piscataway was that that is where the New Jersey Agricultural Museum has its big farm equipment collection associated with Rutgers University. And they had this very finely preserved example of a South Jersey wagon right there, and we were able to transport it down to the museum here for the farmland section.
Now, there are many ethnic groups that farm.
That's right. I mean, this is getting back to that whole notion about there being more than just one single group that could call themselves Pineys. Going all the way back to the mid-19th century, you had a Jewish, well, the mid-19th century groups would include the Italians who moved in, and the Germans. The Germans settling especially in places like Egg Harbor City, and the Italians in places like Hamilton. And they brought with them their traditions. The Germans very much got involved in growing grapes and producing wine. And in fact, the Reno wineries in Egg Harbor City, while it's not a German family, it grows out of that winemaking tradition in the Pinelands. The Italians were involved in a number of different agricultural activities, grape growing to some degree, and then also berry cultivation. And many of the fruit farmers of South Jersey today and the people that own the vegetable stands are Italians. And then in the latter part of the 19th century, you had the establishment of Jewish agricultural colonies. Most people think of the Jews as settling in the cities, but not all of them. Some of them settled in rural South Jersey, in places like Woodbine, which is located in the Pinelands National Reserve, and established agricultural communities there. And more recently, there have been other groups that have moved in, other ethnic groups, especially Hispanic groups, such as the Puerto Ricans, who moved up, especially following World War II in the 1940s and 1950s, originally as seasonal workers, but now who have remained year-round and engage in agricultural activities and have even themselves adopted an identity of being Hispanic Pineys.
There are also so many crafts that each of these groups seem to have perpetuated. I've looked at some of the quilts that were here and the artwork on the walls. It's fascinating.
Yes. Now, some of the craft and artwork is ethnically oriented. There are a whole series of paintings that we have here by Bloomer Permel, who was a descendant of one of the original founders of Alliance, which was one of the Jewish agricultural colonies. And she painted from memory many of the activities of the Jewish farmers of South Jersey, including those that worked in the cranberry bogs. On the other hand, the quilts are not necessarily associated with a particular ethnic group, but rather with the activities of the women of the farmland communities. And this is an activity that went on in the past and actually continues in the present. Several of the quilts that we have here on display come from a group of women in Tabernacle, New Jersey, that call themselves the So-and-Sos. and that's spelled S-E-W and S-E-W. They carry on the quilting tradition in the present, a tradition that goes all the way back to the original farmers of the Pinelands.
With so much heritage to preserve, is the Pinelands protected by an environmental protection agency of any type?
The Pinelands National Reserve was established by the federal government and the state government working together in order to, in fact, protect the natural environment, to protect the Cohansey Aquifer, that is the large aquifer that underlies the whole area, and to ensure that this environment would not become totally disrupted by development. Development is limited by this plan. The state agency which is mandated to carry out this land management plan is the Pinelands Commission. Now, the Pinelands Commission is very much interested in incorporating a concern for and a knowledge of the heritage in their management plan, so that it's hoped that as the environment is being protected, that the traditional lifestyles of the people can also be protected and maintained in the future of the Pinelands.
I hope you enjoyed our tour through the Pinelands today as much as I enjoyed taking you there. You know, the tourist season is coming up, and if you're headed through the south, take time to stop through the Pinelands. And if you're headed up through Trenton, why take time out to stop at the State Museum and see the exhibits. It's really worthwhile. I hope you'll join me next month, and in the meantime, take care.